Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 5th edition of Talk Death. Who owns your body? Funeral Law and Rights, the American edition this time. And today we are with Tanya Marsh and Lee Webster. Hello, Tanya. Hello, Lee.
Hi, Andy.
So we're going to start with a few quick introductions and then get right into your questions. So if you're on Twitter or watching this on YouTube or on Google+, send us your questions with hashtag TalkDeath, and Greg is standing by and he will send them over to us during the event. So I'm Mandy and I'm the founder of Keeper. So what is Keeper? We're essentially a social memorial website where you can store and share all the photos, videos, and stories of your loved ones for free and interact with the Keeper community. And our Keeper mobile app is really awesome. It's out right now for free on Android and iOS, and it gives you exact directions to a monument within a cemetery, including green cemeteries, I always like to add. And it has a really cool function where you can just take the photo of a monument, so the name and the dates, and then it'll come up and bring you the memorial. So you can learn about all the interesting life stories within a cemetery. So go ahead and download it and send us a good review.
So I'm Jeremy. I'm the communications director here at Keeper, and I'm also a PhD candidate in religion and anthropology. My focus is on the intersections between religion, death, and technology. So for those of you who are watching your first Talk Death event, this is the chance for you, the general public, to ask members of the death profession and community your questions. And the reason we did this is that we noticed a huge divide between public and professionals, especially considering that most of you will only encounter a death professional in a funeral setting, unfortunately. So the ultimate goal of Talk Death is really to promote death positivity by creating an open and honest discussion about this huge taboo and fear in Western culture.
Yeah, and I mean, if Jeremy and I are ever at a social gathering or attending a local death cafe or even talking to family, the same questions always pop up. People ask if they can be buried in their backyard or have their ashes spread in a local park. And funeral law is really complex, and people don't really have anywhere to turn unless you can really understand and read legislation in front of you, which is not super easy, which is why we have lawyers and they go to crazy difficult school to do this. So we have two experts who are here to answer all those questions, and they know all those answers, hopefully, probably. Yes, they do. So Tanya Marsh, firstly, teaches at Wake Forest School of Law in North Carolina. She specializes in funeral and cemetery law, especially laws regarding the status, treatment, and disposition of human remains. Tanya has a newly released 586-page book called Cemetery Law, the Common Law of Burying Grounds in the United States. And Tanya's funeral law blog is a great resource for all issues concerning burial, cremation, and other funerary practices. And it can be found at funerallaw.typepad.com.
And so Lee Webster is a member of the Green Burial Council, the National Home Funeral Alliance, and has 30 years of working experience with hospice, healthcare, and conservation-based nonprofits. She's also the director of the New Hampshire Funeral Resources Education and Advocacy Group. And between these obligations and public lecturing, Lee is obviously a very busy woman. Her work is helping shift the conversation back to participatory funerary practices and greater community involvement. And so, Tanya, is there anything here that we missed or anything that you'd like to add about yourself?
Anything funny or interesting?
No, nothing funny, nothing interesting. You guys hit it. Thank you.
And Lee, is there anything that we missed or anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think you did pretty well with the strung out busy part. That's good. And that's thanks to you. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I guess we should get right to the questions then?
Great.
Okay, so the first one is going to be directed at Lee and is sort of an introductory question. So Lee, can you explain to us what a home funeral is and if it is legal for anyone to have a home funeral in the United States today?
Sure. Home funerals are basically, well, see, this is really a hard question after all. Essentially, what we mean by home funeral is that the family directs what happens with the body after the time of death until the time of disposition. So it can mean a home vigil. It can mean, for a few hours or a few days. It means taking custody and control of the body. And to answer the second part of your question, it is legal in every state for the family to have that. However, in 10 states, the state government requires and compels families to hire a funeral director to do pieces and parts, and they're different in each state of those restrictive states. So you can still keep your loved one home, bring your loved one home, care for them. You can do that in concert with a professional or on your own. It all depends on how the family itself defines what it is they're trying to accomplish. Is this sacred time? Is this time you're trying to save money? Is this, what are the reasons that you want to keep a loved one home? In which case we can find support for you. And even in those restrictive states, you're free to follow through with this.
Okay. And is there a legal time limit for keeping a body in most states or in all states?
Yeah, there are different requirements by state that have to do with refrigeration. So, and it also has to do with how each state defines refrigeration. So it gets, if you want to get that far into the weeds about it, then the National Home Funeral Alliance has what we call the quick guide to home funerals by state, and it lays out what those particular restrictions or requirements are. There are very few states that even require refrigeration. We have to remember that most funeral directors don't even have refrigeration. They have a cool room. So yeah, there are things you need to know about them. You want to stay on the right side of the law, but it's very doable.
Mandy, can I jump in and add a couple of things?
Please.
Okay. So with respect to whether or not you have to have a funeral director involved, I think a lot of the states that Lee was talking about, and one of the most common things that you need a funeral director for is to get them to issue or sign a death certificate or burial transit permit, which are the two certificates or permits that have to, occur and be issued by the government. In many states, you have to have a licensed funeral director to get your burial and transit permit, which is required for final disposition of the body. So in effect, those laws have made private for-profit funeral directors quasi-governmental officials. And those are some of the most difficult states for families to do sort of everything by themselves because they can't directly go to the government to get those permits. They have to go through sort of this industry, which is somewhat curious. Curious.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, so our next question is by Ann_Reza on Instagram, and she wants to own a family cemetery on her own property. Is this something that she can establish before anyone has yet to die, or does it only get established after someone has died and has been buried? Or is it even allowed? Yeah, Tanya, if you want to take this.
Sure. Okay, so the word cemetery is a word that's defined by state statute. So there's no federal law that says, in the United States, we're talking about the United States, there's no federal law that says what a cemetery is. We sort of have a you know it when you see it, right? But really, when we look at a cemetery, or when we look at a collection of graves, we tend to say, oh, that's a cemetery, right? But legally, it may or may not be a cemetery. So in most states, the Cemetery Act that governs them was really created to deal with large for-profit or municipal cemeteries, etc. In most states, family cemeteries, that is, you're not selling grave spaces and they're restricted to members of your own family. And in most states, religious cemeteries also are excluded from the legal definition of a cemetery for purposes of these cemetery acts. So the first place you have to look in your particular state to see whether or not you can do a family cemetery is to see what the definition of cemetery is and whether or not it would apply to family burial grounds, etc. The second place you have to look is zoning law, local zoning law. Before I got interested in this area of the law, I'm a property and real estate attorney, so this is hardcore real estate law. Zoning law is all local, and in some states, every square inch of the state is zoned, and then the government says you can do this activity in this part of the the county or whatever, or you can't do these other activities. And in some states, it's really only the cities that are zoned, and then the country is not. So you have to sort of look at two different legal threshold tests, right? One is, does the state want to govern my family cemetery? That's the first thing you have to look at. And the second is, based on where I live and where the land is located, what restrictions, if any, is the local government going to put on my ability to put human bodies into the ground here? What are they going to require me to do? Do I have to tell the local government, etc.?
Lee, have you had any experience with families requesting this?
I've had quite a bit of experience with home burials, yes. And in more than just, I'm in New Hampshire and familiar with Maine and Vermont to either side of me. And we all have pretty lax zoning here for the most part. In the state of New Hampshire, there's one township that doesn't allow home burial. The rest of the state is good to go. And yeah, it happens quite frequently, and it happens for interesting reasons as well. If we can take a minute for that. The reason that people are looking to put bodies on their own property has less to do with money, I think, than it has to do with the environmental ramifications of the way that we're doing burial these days, which is in a steel box, steel from China or mahogany from rainforest woods or whatever, stuck inside a concrete box so that they can keep the lawn mowed nicely above ground. And all of those things are leaching things out into the soil. The bodies aren't the problem. We know that from four major, health organizations, the World Health Organization and so on. So I think a lot of people are doing this for environmental reasons, which could be misguided, honestly. We're trying to develop green burial cemeteries at different levels, particularly conservation levels, so that we have a central place. And I think Tanya can speak to this, the reason why cemeteries are important culturally and spiritually for us. But one of the issues is, people do want to bury close to their home, recognizing that they may leave their home. They need to be concerned about that. I always ask people, is this desire of yours to bury on your own property about money, or are you concerned about furthering conservation goals? If you are, we need to keep talking.
Right. And Tanya, maybe this is for you on the real estate side. What happens if you sell your property and there's some bodies buried there?
Well, yeah. So first you have to look to state law to see if there's anything specific. But in general, once a body's in the ground, you have an implied easement at common law for the remains to stay there. So every state criminalizes disinterment without consent of particular people, and typically a state statute will say you cannot dig somebody up without the consent of next of kin, the owner of the real estate, and then if it was somebody who bought a family plot in a larger cemetery, you need their consent too, etc. Right? So the states are different. So yeah, if you buy land that has a body there, you're gonna pretty much need to keep the body there absent a court order, because there are criminal statutes that would prevent you from interfering either with the body itself or with a tombstone, etc.
I imagine that you would need to, if you were selling your property and for whatever reason you didn't want to bring the bodies with you, you would probably need to disclose that as well.
It has to be disclosed in the deed. You have to, at least here, it has to be included in the deed. And again, I always ask people, how valuable is your property going to be at that point? Did you bury Marilyn Monroe or Sid Vicious? What are people going to want?
Well, it should be disclosed in a deed, but even if you don't disclose it in a deed, you can't just go remove the bodies. So there's what you should do and what you can do, right? Which are
That's super interesting.
But also, I'd just say that in a lot of parts of the country, family burial grounds are a really important cultural heritage monument. My family is from Nebraska, and there are little corners of farms throughout the state where the members of the immediate family were buried, on a little hilltop, etc. So there's people still using those little family cemeteries.
Actually, we have a small related question, and this one's by @Adventures in Death Care on Instagram that asked, is it true that private land is not considered a cemetery until 6 descendants have been buried there?
No, it's true in some states that you can't establish a cemetery unless it meets minimum requirements in terms of numbers of graves. So there may be a state statute that says you have to have 6 graves before it becomes a quote-unquote cemetery. But the law generally doesn't, the state laws do not generally govern graves, individual graves, in the same way they do cemeteries, right? So maybe you could put somebody, if you had unzoned land and the state had a threshold of a half an acre or 3 acres or 6 bodies to do a cemetery, that doesn't stop you from putting a single home burial in your backyard or 2 or et cetera, right? So there's just different kinds of facets to those questions, I guess.
We have another burial question. Lee, Jay Stone on our blog asked us if people who have home funerals choose to have a certain kind of burial typically. Can you have a home funeral and then say a traditional burial in a cement vault? Or are you seeing families request to bury their loved ones at home, over which we already asked, but
like which one do you see more?
Yeah.
Well, this is a really great question because honestly, a lot of people come to home funeral through green burial because they kind of back up the experience. What they realize is that they want to have this very natural way out without all of this, pollutant happening. And then they think, well, then why would I put an embalmed body with formaldehyde, which has, and all benzene and everything else that's in there, all the antifreeze. Why would I want to do that? And then they back up to how am I going to have what's the funeral going to look like if this is going to be the result, and how can I keep that authentic and consistent? So they come back to home funeral, and when people do it that way, it tends to be pretty cool because it means they've established that they have the ability to have a green burial or a home burial, and where you can do whatever you want. You make your own rules within reason, whatever the state rule is. But for people going the other way who decide, and I see this all the time, particularly with hospice patients who realize that they can stay home. They don't have to suddenly have the body whisked away. They'll keep the body home for a little bit afterwards. Again, they're often mandatory, time limits kind of thing. You have to pay attention to that. But then they realize, okay, I've done all of this natural, wonderful stuff. I've bathed the body and anointed the body, and I, cared for them, put them on dry ice or Techni ice or whatever, to keep them cool in a cool room. I've done everything right. It all feels exactly right. Now I have to go to the local cemetery, buy a vault, stick them in it, and so on. That's where the disconnect is. So see what I mean about walking it backwards. You kind of need to start at the end and then think your way through how you're going to get to that point as consistently as possible. And I see it a lot because people are calling me to say, how can I make this happen? Mm-hmm. And that's really what home funeral guides can help with. In both the burial aspect, they know a lot about green burials and they know what's available, and they also know how to prepare step by step to make sure that the family's wishes and the decedent's wishes are followed.
And where can people access these guidelines?
The guidelines, basically, you'll find the guidelines and the guides who can help interpret them for you on the National Home Funeral Alliance website. We have directories where you can go in and you can catch people, all over the country and Canada and the UK. Awesome. Anybody who wants to be listed on these directories is. We just want to be sure that people can find someone in their area who can help walk them through. So you can go there, look for home funeral guides. You can even look for home funeral friendly funeral directors. We have a lot of them who are on board with this. They want to help families. They want them to get what they need.
That's unexpected and really interesting. Is there like a certain state where you have more funeral directors that are really open to home funerals than others?
No, I would say it's pretty. You have to take a look at the directory, but my experience is all over the country, and I speak a lot to funeral directors themselves at their own conventions. trying to get them on board with green funerals in general, meaning home funerals and green burial. And they're, the really good ones, the ones who are there to serve families, which is most of them, honestly, are there. They want to provide this. What's holding them up is the number of green cemeteries that are viable.
Right.
They've got to remember they're in the business to help families through this.
Lee, I have a question. So, a lot of death practices in modernity really shifted towards secularization. Are you seeing with home funerals any forms of religiosity or spirituality that tend to go hand in hand with them?
Oh yeah, this is a really great question and one we could do an entire program on. This is near and dear to my heart too. What we're finding, I guess I can bring you back to the first question. If you go to the directories, you're going to see a listing of celebrants. So we certainly encourage people to include their local clergy, whoever they might be, in both home setting funerals, or some people have home funerals and then they'll move to their church and have a ceremony before they go on to disposition. So home funeral doesn't mean that we get rid of any of those things. But your question, I think, has more to do with the unchurched, and we're looking, of course, at more of that. It's one of the driving factors in why cremation has over 50% right now. People are leaving that behind. They're leaving the ritual and the ceremony behind, and the response to that has been, first of all, PTSD-like symptoms in families who didn't take the time to acknowledge their loved one and the tear in the fabric that occurs, and that's the purpose of the funeral, is to knit that all back together again. So we're seeing that. We're seeing a lot of unhealthy grieving and a lot of confusion with families through direct cremation particularly. So we are seeing then a rise in celebrants, people who are either, I would call them non-denominational, some of them call themselves interfaith, but they're people who are learning how to conduct rituals and ceremonies without that standard religious base, so that they can reach out to people who want to access some kind of spiritual meaning through the death process. So, it's an interesting shift. It's like, one thing goes down and another thing pops up to take its place, and it's the same in this area.
But just for a little historical perspective on this, we've only had a commercial funeral industry in the United States for about 130 years. And before that, it was families and religious communities and secular communities that were in charge of bodies. So the shifts that are going on in American culture towards secularization are sort of unrelated, I think, to people wanting to reclaim more control of remains, because back in the day, when families had pretty exclusive control, it was deeply religious, right? So the idea that somehow we're losing the religious nature of them because people want to reclaim them from a for-profit industry is kind of a curious idea. I know it's a popular idea, it's just sort of a curious idea.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you say that too, because I would agree with that. I think that the more control families have, the more responsibility, and honestly, it's a responsibility and a privilege to care for your loved one. The more you have that, the more you attach meaning to it, and the more and it goes back into that spiritual world. It's what Joe Seehey of the Green Burial Council called accessing the divine. That this is the time out of time that we can use in order to connect both the living and the dead. And if we're not doing that in a conscious way, we're not doing that in a meaningful way, we're just shipping it off to an outsourced party to try and make it easier on us. I have a big deal about feeling pain. I'm one of those people who actually asked to have no Novocaine. I really do. I honestly feel as though we've made not feeling pain a real mission in this country. We feel pain when someone dies. We're supposed to. And every act that we do to care for them during that process, when we are feeling the most pain, moves us further in through the grief process and helps us open to the divine in others and to whatever we see. So I do kind of, I mean, I see that. I think your point, Tanya, of going back to when people were really doing this, they were deeply religious.
Yeah.
That's the disconnect right now. There's a big disconnect.
Super interesting. It's a really interesting shift that's happening right now. So we have another question that's totally the opposite end, perhaps, of the spectrum. Jeremy, you want to? It's a funny one. You can ask.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, a lot of people really wanted to know about the legality of keeping human remains. So Tanya at Squiddle Terror on Twitter asked, can you get your skeleton articulated and given back to your family? Can they just keep it around with permission from the deceased?
No.
We all want to know.
No, pretty much no. Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, so the states have laws that say human remains have to be disposed of in particular ways. Most states have restrict you to burial or cremation or donation to scientific study, that sort of thing, right? There's some states have an other category, but most of those states are other reasonable or community, in accordance with community standards, etc., which would take out some of those kind of crazy things. There's also criminal statutes that say that you can't treat human remains in ways that are contrary to established community standards or reasonable family sensibilities, sort of the standards differ from place to place, but I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of community support for, removing flesh from the body, articulating the skeleton, and displaying it in the living room. So I think you have two problems. One are the state statutes that limit your disposition options, and the second is all those anti-desecration statutes.
You've just disappointed probably half of the people
We're
watching.
going to lose all of our
viewers. I am such a bummer. You guys don't even know. I disappoint people all the time. I'm used to it. Not my fault.
But there are some other ways of dealing with this that are not quite so direct. Maybe you can't have mom's skeleton in the living room, as you say, but if you opt for cremation, for instance, which has some environmental drawbacks, but some offsets are that you can have those cremains added to a reef ball that helps repopulate the reefs on the ocean floor. You can't, so they've done some good.
Or turned into art glass, right? Or
I was going to say art glass, jewelry, things like that. You can still. I mean, I've had them made for friends. I've taken them to a jeweler who specializes in adding those. It's quite Victorian, like the old hair paintings and that kind of thing. That's really coming back. People are doing hair paintings, and they're doing jewelry with cremains in them, wearing them around their neck, and
This actually reminds me of an encounter that Tanya and I had when we were at the last National Funeral Directors Association, and there's a company who is taking off a tattooed part of your loved one's body, the skin of it, and then putting it in a frame for you to hang. Mm-hmm. And I know that when we were first introduced to that, Tanya, your first reaction was, uh-oh. So any developments on this? Is this legal? Are we allowed to have someone skinned and put in a frame?
No. No. Now, of course, they say yes, so I don't want it. There's the laws of 50 different states to consider, but I will note that they have changed their business model, and now they're asking funeral directors to do the skinning and send them the skin. So I think it's actually the funeral directors that are committing the crime if they participate in this project.
That's interesting. I don't know if they've actually ever had, if they had at this point, families participate in it.
They have really nice business cards, very thick.
Good Instagram account too.
Yeah. A nice website. They spent money and they care deeply about this, whether or not they can actually do it or not.
Well, I mean, if anyone's on Twitter right now, if you want your loved one to have, your favorite tattoo in a frame, let us know. Tweet it out, and we can share the name of the company. I can't remember it offhand, and look into it. Let us know if you run into
Save Your
issues.
Tattoo or something like that, I think.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to the next one. Is it this one?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Lee, maybe this one's more for you. Essentially, I think as we started talking earlier, there's been a ton of movement on green burial right now, which is awesome. And with that comes a lot of new alternative products that are coming out. So at Daniel R's, or Daniela ZS, I'm not sure, on Instagram, is asking, is it legal to use burial alternatives such as Capsula Mundi's tree pods?
Well, as we mentioned earlier too, they're not real yet. They're not in production. There are some real drawbacks to this and some other products that we could certainly get into. It's not a question of legality so much about these products. It's whether they work or not. You know, I just encourage people. I'm glad because these things are all coming out and they're making people think. But the other issue is, you know, the practical piece of this. As we were talking about with the Capsula Mundi, first of all, the edges, the outside shell is made of what they're calling a biodegradable plastic. Not really sure how to go with that. The person who is being buried needs to be in a fetal position. That's not always an easy thing to do. It's very difficult to carry a person in a flat casket, no less in a big eggshell, and we have no way of burying someone in this. So there's a lot of things to be worked out in this piece. We're looking at things like bio-urns, where we're taking cremains and then we're selling it in a large coffee cup with a seed on top. This brings up all kinds of issues for environmentalists. You know, first of all, what's the seed? Is it indigenous? Is it going to be invasive? But the main issue with that is that cremated remains consist of calcium, phosphate, and sodium. Nothing grows in sodium. So all these products that you see look lovely, they're well-meaning, but they don't work. So, you know, we're trying to, you know, separate the wheat from the chaff on a lot of these products. Most of them are really simply unnecessary. They're beautiful. So what we're taking from what people want is they want beauty, they want simplicity, they want something that's authentic to the life of the person that we're honoring. You know, it feels to me as though the need to have cremation tattoos and then having that, you know, peeled off and, you know, please not a lampshade, pretty much says to me that people are looking for this knee-jerk swing in products and you know, rituals and, you know, the new tradition. They're fed up with the way things have been done. They're making their message really clear. They're doing it by exploring things that really aren't realistic or cost-effective, you know. But it's imaginative. It means that we're in a whole new place about this, and that's what's really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, maybe in terms of the legality specifically of this question, I know, for example, in Canada, or maybe it's just in a certain province, I can't remember exactly, that you cannot be buried in a cemetery unless you're within an actual coffin. So there's, and this also takes to another side of this where most people don't even know this, but cemeteries themselves, private cemeteries or even municipal cemeteries, they can actually create their own legislation. So if one cemetery you know, allows green burial and just a shroud, another one will say, no, you need to have like not even a pine box, like a full coffin or, you know, thick, heavy-duty steel type casket. So let's say, you know, in the world where, let's say, Capsula Mundi, once it is out and there are cemeteries, like how would I know if I can use it or not? In this case, like, am I allowed to be buried in a pod? Because pods, you know, it's new, right? There's no law around this yet.
Well, from a legal perspective, green burial is burial, right? So what I mean by that is state laws don't require the use of vaults. The vast majority of states don't require the use of caskets. You can be buried in a shroud. that's green burial, right? No vault, no casket. So why is everybody, or not everybody, but so many people buried in a vault and a casket? Because, as you said, Mandy, the cemetery rules require it. And the law is incredibly permissive in terms of allowing cemeteries to set their own rules. Now, if you have sort of like a normal functioning market among cemeteries, then one would think that some cemeteries are going to have really lax standards and others are going to have tight standards, and you can have a choice. But in reality, in most urban markets, you don't have much of a choice because you have a couple of very large companies that control a lion's share of the market, and they make rules that protect their ability to sell you things like caskets and vaults, right? So that's why so much green burial. There's definitely established cemeteries that have green burial sections to them in various places, but that's why you see so much, I think, activity in the green burial area in these brand new cemeteries, because these are people who are not currently participating in this sort of industry or market and are coming in and saying, I'm going to create a whole different set of rules that's not supporting sort of the funeral industry, but is just supporting green burial. But from a legal perspective, we don't need any of that stuff as a general rule.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. Certainly a New England point of view here. We have mandatory municipal cemeteries in each town here, and what we do every March in good old town meetings is that we vote in our cemetery trustees, and as soon as we've got somebody else to do that job, we walk away from it and we don't pay any attention. And what we need are people with vision and and a little bit of courage to start taking on these positions. I mean, Bernie Sanders will tell you, my New England guy will tell you that we all need to be participating in government at different levels, and if it means the cemetery trustee job where you meet once a month and you figure out how to manage the funds and all that, and you get to strike down the bylaw that says you were requiring a vault, we could turn all these cemeteries into green cemeteries, at least portions of it, in these, particularly the hybrids, the conventionals that have the land set aside. Here's why it's important: because people want their loved ones to be buried near them, because we have this incredible need as humans for a sense of place. And we don't get that when we say, oh, this is wonderful, there's a green burial cemetery 600 miles away, let's fire up the station wagon and take a trip. It doesn't meet any of our needs at all. And so what we need is more space, small space even, closer to us, so that we can keep that connection going. And we can do it ourselves. Local government, what could be more accessible? We can do it.
With that in mind, so for say alternatives that are effective or alternatives that are being embraced by consumers, are you noticing any shifts in cemetery regulations, and do you see cemeteries adapting to these new consumer requests?
I certainly am. Tanya, do you have something to say about that?
I mean, just the fact that some cemeteries have created green burial sort of segments, right? That's about the only change I've seen.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that I'm seeing, because I'm tracking this as much as I can, both within the Green Burial Council certification system and outside of it, and I just wrote a paper about this for them called To Lie in Green Pastures, How the Catholic Church is Leading the Way in Green Burial. So back again to the spiritual piece. These cemeteries, these guys are saying, well, of course, we never wanted to do cremation. Cremation in the Catholic Church means that you've removed all of the bodies that are going to be intact for the rapture. So we've got to keep them all together and intact. That's why we have full burial, right? Full body burial. So they're thrilled. The Catholic Church is just thrilled to have green burial back. It's just going to make it easier. And here's the alternative for people who were choosing cremation because they thought it was more environmental and all that kind of thing. So I'm seeing a huge uptick in conventional Catholic cemeteries where they're creating space.
The only problem with that, Lee, is that in so many of the archdioceses, they have signed 50-year plus ground leases with Stewart or SCI or another one of the large cemetery companies, so they don't really control. The Catholic Church in Philadelphia and Newark and Los Angeles, they don't control their cemeteries, and they won't for a half of a century.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
But
unfortunate.
they got some money up front, which they desperately need. So
That's true.
Okay, so on to another question. Of course, another interesting one, because we have very interesting followers. So at Megamia on Twitter and at Cecilia Rodart on Instagram both want to know, can you legally have your body in a field and eaten by vultures or other animals, just like in a certain Buddhist
After
tradition?
you die.
Yes, after you die.
That's good. Thank you for clarifying that. No. Please see earlier comments about all those anti-desecration criminal statutes. This is the problem, right? We have all these anti-desecration statutes on the books. Whether they're enforced or not, right, is a totally different thing. But I think the law enforcement community would not be super happy about somebody doing that, because the state has a really strong interest in wanting to figure out whether or not a crime has been committed, right? And so the state has the right to conduct an autopsy even over the religious and personal objections of the family members and the deceased themselves, if, it depends on the state, but if they suspect foul play, etc. So allowing yourself to be, eaten by vultures in a field, is that what it was?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think they'd not be cool with that.
I guess if people really wanted to, because this is actually something I hear all the time from people, I'll just leave my body in the forest. Just leave my body and let the animals take care of it. But I guess if people really wanted that, they could always donate their bodies to a body farm.
They could. There's not that many body farms, but they surely could. There's one at Western Carolina University. There's one in Tennessee. Not sure how many.
Explain what that is for people who don't know what a body farm is?
Yeah, so a body farm is well, let's see, a definition of a body farm. So they're all these sort of academic and research enterprises, and it's a piece of land where they're doing forensic research on what happens to human remains under certain conditions. So it's actually been really great for law enforcement, because they've been able to figure out, how long has a body been outside, if it's in this state of decomposition, etc. And the body farm at Western Carolina is actually doing research for Urban Death Project, and doing some tests on composting materials in support of their work.
Interesting. If you don't know about Urban Death Project, we did our last Talk Death on them, so just check out our channel, by the way, little plug there.
I mentioned one other thing really quickly, and that is the Crestone Project in Colorado, which is the only legal open-air cremation group, and my understanding is that they're actually starting to organize a little bit better so that you don't have to bring the body to Colorado, but that there are people who will come to you, or are planning to. I don't think this is happening yet, but they're planning to be able to find other places in the country where they can offer this open-air cremation service. And yeah, to go back to the, put the bodies out in the field, this worked really well, but we live in a different world now, and even in Tibetan tradition, the vultures have gotten terribly ill. We have a problem with the vultures for the Tibetan sky burial now, because the bodies that they've been, picking up are full of chemicals. So even that system, that really ancient system, is on its way out. So the idea of putting a body out in my backyard in, suburbia somewhere, even here in the backwoods of New Hampshire, is not going to work very well when a joint comes home in a dog's mouth.
Yeah,
so
that doesn't
let's
sound
have respect for others. Yeah.
Well, we had to ask it.
Well, before you ask, the same applies to Viking burials. Just,
that was
the flaming arrow situation. Yeah,
that was a question that we got.
It's always a question.
That's a real Hollywood version of it too. It's the reality is very different.
Well, perfect segue, because this question involves an axe. Lee.
Okay. Lizzie Borden.
So I have a Dracula on Twitter, has a question about green burials as well, and he wants to know, is it typical to prohibit burial with jewelry and or other non-biodegradable things like an art object or an axe?
Yeah, that is actually a really good question because depending on the green burial cemetery and what they've come up with for their rules and how strict they're going to be about it, you can either be, bring whatever you want to, again, on your underground Viking burial. Maybe don't bring any virgins, but other than that, you'll be okay. In other ones, I've heard where they insist on ripping the zippers out of men's flies because they want absolutely nothing, and the caskets have to be made with a particular biodegradable glue, kind of thing. So again, it's going to be all over the place. I see it all as experimentation, trying to figure out, where we're going to settle out. What's going to be the most practical, pragmatic, reasonable way of doing this? Can we make sure that there are no chemicals going into the ground with a green burial? No, our bodies are full of heavy metals that we've been dealing with. Soil, the perfect filter for that. So I'm not worried about it. But are we really going to take somebody apart during their home funeral and take their teeth out? Are we going to take their knee?
Right.
We need to be reasonable. So my guess is you could find a green burial spot that says it's okay for you to have your handmade axe, and you go for it. I'm not worried. You're only buried once.
That's the first time I've ever heard that one.
I think Dracula is going to be very happy with that answer. So
this is more on, I suppose, on the legal end of things. Not as funny, actually very practical, which is a question that many people have. So Kate Pearson on our blog is asking, my wife is Jewish, but she wants to be cremated. Her family is very against the idea. If she died, what sort of legal protection would she have? Maybe Tanya, do you want to try to tell us more about this one?
Sure. So at common law, meaning judge-made law, the law we inherited, both Canada and the United States inherited from England, the deceased has a right to determine the place and manner of disposition of their own remains. That's a common law right. There's cases in the United States this year that reiterate that right. In modern times, though, we also have state statutes that in some ways constrain that and in some ways give guidance to it. So not every state, most states have a statute that says this is the order of control or order of priority of control of disposition of body and who can make decisions. In states that have that, sometimes the decedent is at the top of the list, so they can leave binding written instructions in various ways that's dictated by state law. Sometimes they can appoint a particular person, a designated agent, to make those decisions for them. Sometimes the law says if you pay for everything in advance and have a pre-need contract with a funeral director, then that's going to be honored, and the state will make sure that's honored. But next in priority, even without all those other things, is going to be the spouse. Spouse is always going to have priority in every single state in the country. Spouse has priority over parents, children, siblings, best friend, everybody. The only person who can trump a spouse is the decedent themselves, and that's not even true in every state.
So what can someone do to ensure that their wishes are honored?
They have to find out what the law is in their particular state with respect to this, because this is a very technical area and details matter a lot. There was a case in Iowa just a couple of years ago, I think a very sad case, about a woman who had been living in New Mexico, and she was separated from her husband, not legally divorced. She and her husband had 10 children. This is the Mary Florence Whalen case, if you're familiar with it. She had written a will and said she wanted to be buried in Montana. They'd lived most of their adult life in Billings. She had pre-purchased a casket from some Trappist monks, and so it's in her will. She did everything in accordance with New Mexico law. She goes back to Iowa, where her husband was living, to visit some of their children, finds out she has terminal cancer, never goes back to New Mexico. And so when she died, her sister, all 10 children, went to the funeral director and said, these are our mother's wishes. Her husband went in and said, no, no, I want her to be buried in this local cemetery. And she had to sit in a refrigerator at the funeral home until the Iowa Supreme Court said that even though she had done all of that in accordance with New Mexico state law, she died in Iowa, and it wasn't in accordance with Iowa state law, and therefore her husband got to trump what everybody agreed were her clearly stated wishes. So this is something that you can't mess around with. You have to make sure you know. I mean, we can't control, unless we stay at home forever, we can't control where we die, right? So there's always going to be sort of an element of uncertainty there. But at least with respect to your home state, you should know what the rules are and make sure that you follow them.
So if I'm not mistaken, what you're saying is that if you live in Iowa and you have a will in Iowa, or even if you've bought a plot of land at a cemetery in Iowa, but you die in California, you're not necessarily under Iowa regulation anymore.
So if I'm a resident, I'm a resident of the state of Indiana. I know I teach in North Carolina. Let's not even talk about that. So I'm a resident of the state of Indiana. So my will, if I die, as long as I'm a resident of the state of Indiana, will be interpreted under Indiana state law. It doesn't matter where I die. So that's sort of a reciprocity agreement that all the states have amongst one another. They do not have the same reciprocity agreement with respect to disposition of human remains. So what that means is the way all the statutes are written is they apply to all remains that are in that state, right? So if I die, wherever I die, it's the law of that state that dictates what happens to me. Now, in the Iowa case, it was a little fuzzy because she'd been in Iowa for 6 months. And so the court kind of said, well, you know, we think maybe she was a resident of Iowa again and not a resident of New Mexico anymore. But that wasn't part of their decision. And who would know that anyway, right? In fact, I've looked for this because this is a really strange thing in the law. And there's not a single case in the United States that says that a state will recognize the disposition laws of another state in the same way they would respect their wills law, for example. So maybe you can get away with things. It depends on, does everybody agree, and what's the funeral director sympathetic, etc. But technically, push comes to shove, the courts are going to enforce the laws of the state you died in.
Interesting. That's super complicated and nuanced. It almost, I don't know, it's not super comforting, but as long as you sort of write it out and have it straight for your state, then you should
Full
be
employment for lawyers.
But luckily for Mr. Pearson, who asked the question, seeing as you are her husband, you do have that final say. So if you respect her wishes, then she will get them. So that's at least good to know on that end.
So long as she dies in the state that she lives in.
No, but she just mentioned that, right? I think so. Even if she dies in another state, then he would have the right because he's her spouse.
Yeah, in every state, the spouse is going to trump everybody else. But
exactly.
With respect to that question and any others, I can't tell you what the legal answer is in all 50 states. I'm only licensed to practice in the state of Indiana. And so even though I've read all the laws, and Lee's read all these laws as well, but you really need to talk. This is too important. You have to go talk to a lawyer in your own state and make sure you understand what the rules are.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would add that you want to be sure that part of what we're talking about here is advance directives. And one of the things that people don't understand about advance directives is that they don't really have anything to do with funeral planning.
Right.
So, you know, an advance directive, a durable power of attorney for health care ends when the person dies. And the durable power for finance isn't really just going to pick up where they left off. If you haven't left your plans and told people what it is that you really want, and then hope that all these other pieces that Tanya's talking about fall into place, then you're out of luck. So,
and worse than that, Lee, those proxies, healthcare proxies, etc., those are reciprocal. The states will respect them. And many states, in fact, promulgate as part of their form for these healthcare proxies, what do you want to happen with your funeral? That isn't even enforceable in those states because it contradicts the other statutes that talk about disposition priority. So even within state statutes in a single state, they are internally inconsistent, but at the end of the day, the disposition statutes are going to control over whatever that proxy says. So those are the ones you need to make sure you look at.
Right, and make sure you have real conversations with the people who are going to be in charge, because that's what's going to matter.
That's
Right.
the most important, absolutely.
Right.
So we're just about finishing up our time here. And before we let everyone go, we wanted to know if you had any projects or anything you wanted to let our viewers know about before the end.
Tanya, we can start with you.
Do I have any projects?
Or anything you'd like to promote or share with everyone.
Oh, anything I want to promote? Yeah, oh, sure. Okay, I'm so good at this. Well, so as you guys mentioned at the outset, I have a book on cemetery law that is fascinating, which I co-authored actually with a student of mine, Daniel Gibson, who graduated from Wake Forest Law School. He's a fledgling lawyer. That's up on Amazon. It's cheap, even though it's super long. I also have a book called Law of Human Remains, which is not cheap. It's also up on Amazon. But it is a list of all the laws in all the states that are relevant to pretty much everything we talked about today, and a lot of other topics as well. So I've spent the last 6 years trying to make sure I really understood all of this law, because I think unless you really understand what the legal landscape is, you can't, and why the law is the way it is, you can't start to critique it. So those two books represent me understanding what the law is. So now I'm kind of moving on to critiquing it. So stay tuned.
And Lee?
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting reading, by the way. These books are really fascinating and really bolster a lot of the work that I'm doing with both green burial and home funeral, because you need to understand this first before you can keep going. I would push people in the direction of both the Green Burial Council. If you go to the website, the resources page, and go to education, you're going to find just loads of information, educational stuff we've been working on to try and fill in a lot of these questions that people have been asking is answered in pretty nice detail there, including the science of green burial, which a lot of, if you're really into detail about skin and stuff, you're going to love this. And I'd also send people to the National Home Funeral Alliance, because we have tons of educational material. We have step-by-step guides on how to have a home funeral, what you need to do, A, B, C, and D. We've got legal stuff. We've got, you name it. And our real goal is to connect people to each other so that we can build this community and build this awareness around death and take it back. It's really in our own hands. Our job in both of these organizations is to empower people to be truly present in all of this work, and to be truly present with people, with their own mortality and with the people around them.
Awesome.
Okay. With that said, we invite all of our viewers to follow us on all of our different social media platforms. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, probably about 5 other things. You can also read our blog, which is keeper.com/blog.
It's spelled funny, so we put it right there so you can all see it.
We also have a newsletter, so if you go onto our blog, there is a sign-up bar at the top. So we send a newsletter about once a month, no spam.
Yeah, just essentially every time we do one of these events, we'll send you a notification. So if you're interested, just put in your email there. And of course, head on to your app store and download our awesome app. And feel free to go onto our website and create an online memorial, even for yourself. This is great for pre-planning, like we were just talking about. You can write out your own legacy and write out your wishes and everything on Keeper, and have it saved with your loved one, with your keeper, who's going to preserve all that for you.
Stay tuned as well for our next Talk Death, which will hopefully be at the end of August or beginning of September. So we'll keep everyone informed. Lee and Tanya, stay on the line.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
That was awesome, and thank you all for watching. And this will all be on YouTube as well. So
goodbye.
What do people say? Check it out.
Yeah.